Aesthetics are a weird thing. Some people think aesthetics simply means visuals, but it's far more than that. Aesthetics is even more than just artistic style. It's the blending and melding of effective artistic techniques to create an appealing and deeply satisfying rendering. Of course, you can always just look at the definition that's online for what aesthetic means, and that's fine, I guess, but I mean it's accurate. I'm not saying it's not, but there it is. Now, that could mean a lot of things, but in the case of today's video, I'm talking about a particular aesthetic, one that's beauty is not exactly always recognized by all those who perceive or judge artistic merit.
Bullshit. Bullshit. Derivative.
You see, these days, many video games are developed with the intent to capture the quote-unquote retro aesthetic. Take Shovel Knight, or the other many indie games that's visual style attempts to mimic the classic visuals and sounds of a time gone past. But why attempt to recreate, quote-unquote, the past? Is it simply to appeal to those who enjoyed video games from past periods of time and capitalize off nostalgia? Well, okay, yeah, of course it is. Of course. But I think there's actually something deeper to the retro aesthetic, and in studying this aesthetic, we as appreciators and even potential developers of video games can learn something, not just about electronic entertainment, but about art and the very philosophy of noticing and appreciating beauty. I know it may all sound quite silly, but there's something deeper here in between the huge pixels and mechanical musical notes, if you're willing to look, that is. Back in the 80s and 90s, video games were just taking off in terms of mainstream popularity, but the computer graphics and system used to display said video games were limited compared to today's technology. Obviously. You look at hyper-realistic graphics in Unreal 5, and then you look at Pitfall. They're a little different. We had big blocky pixels and bloopy sounding noises and tunes that came from clunky cartridges being electronically ran inside boxes of circuitry, usually connected through a monitor of some sort. Whether it was a television set, arcade cabinet screen, or a computer desktop, video games had a particular look and feel to them. They had simple controls and gameplay mechanics that were often designed so that just about anyone could pick up and play. Think about Pong or Atari 2600 games. But these weren't exactly games that could necessarily compete with photorealism like some of the video game experiences we have today. As a matter of fact, it was almost the exact opposite, really. Pixels in their state couldn't be used to create polygonal forms and depth like they can now, and they wouldn't be able to for quite some time. Thus, there ended up becoming certain standards for video game visuals, based around the processing power of the respective console or computer one was playing said video games on. 8-bit consoles like the Sega Master System or more popular Nintendo Entertainment System became the standard for much of the mid to late 80s, and that got the ball rolling in terms of technological development for video games, especially seeing that the NES actually saved the video games industry from crashing and burning in the mid 80s. These 8-bit games had limited sound chips and color counts, meaning there was only so many different colors of pixels that could be shown on screen at once, and only so many moving sprites before the games turned into slowed down, basically slideshows, making processors chug to show animations. However, this specific point in video games was a wellspring of quality design and entertainment, despite its limitations. Games like Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, Shinobi, or any number of classic arcade games created an aesthetic standard of sorts for their era. This 8-bit look and sound would somewhat quickly be drowned away by modern technological advancements and the push for capital on the part of video game hardware and software companies, as 16-bit systems and games soon began hitting the marketplace. Before Nintendo had their own 16-bit system, Sega had released the Genesis or Mega Drive, depending on where you lived, of course. And it featured more colors, more sounds, and more speed. Its so-called quote-unquote blast processing wasn't just an advertising gimmick, it was literally stronger hardware. Games like Sonic the Hedgehog, Altered Beast, and Shining Force were utilizing their new shiny hardware to create graphics and soundtracks that 8-bit aesthetics just quite simply couldn't compete with. Once Nintendo had finally released the sequel to the NES, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the 16-bit era had officially been, well, officiated. Though I'm sure Sega fans will say that that was really when the Genesis came out and, this and that. But really, the SNES was the indicator of that time. There was other competitors too, like the TurboGrafx 16, also known as the PC Engine, and even more. And of course, we really can't forget about the arcades, which always had better, brighter graphics and sounds than what was offered on home console. And of course, personal computers were already doing things that home consoles couldn't compete with either. Though with every new system, the gap between aesthetics of the arcade cabinet games and the home entertainment video games grew narrower and narrower. This era, too, left a lasting impact on video games and the fans who played them, with some arguing video games really only began hitting their artistic stride, quote-unquote, with the arrival of this said 16-bit aesthetic. This trend of more colors and more memory would continue, but at this point the video games industry began to see that there wasn't exactly a clear path forward for hardware. Add-on hardware attachments to play 32-bit games or games that had full CD sound quality were, unfortunately, often overlooked. Flashy new sounds and graphics weren't necessarily enough to captivate consumers and overall audiences. Sure, there was always Mode 7 graphics on the Super Nintendo that aimed to create the illusion of dimensional depth, but we already had less smooth versions of these graphics in arcade games like Space Harrier much earlier. We can't forget early first-person shooters on PC that were also simulating forms of depth as well. Despite this, simulating forms of Z-axis movement and other alternative visuals just wasn't quite hitting the gamer market like many industry folk clearly wanted it to. Well, until 3D polygonal rendering became cheaper, I guess. While yes, there had already been 3D graphics in games before this point, whether it was souped-up arcade games or the ugly polygons we'd seen in the Panasonic 3DO or Atari Jaguar, it was the arrival of the 32-bit Sony PlayStation and later 64-bit Nintendo 64 that brought the gaming industry into a new era of aesthetics. Despite this really only being the mid to late 1990s, it became hard not to look at 8-bit games as quote-unquote old school and outdated. But many watching nowadays would say the very same about Super Mario 64 or Tekken 2. The aesthetic of being on the cutting edge of technology is not really a long-lasting one, and for many, it's not always one that particularly ages well. However, after this point, games took off in the particular direction of refining 3D graphics to get closer and closer to a sense of reality, with textures and 3D models gaining more detail and opportunity for greater motion as technology continued advancing. With new generations of children being raised on higher and higher technological standards, games of the 8 and 16-bit era fell further and further by the wayside. Sure, there was portable consoles like the Game Boy series of handhelds that continued the aesthetic in some sense, with the Game Boy Advance really capitalizing on how similar it was to the Super Nintendo. But it wasn't long till the handheld market exceeded these visual standards too, with consoles like the PlayStation Portable and later 3DS really boasting higher quality polygonal games. So I guess that brings us back to Shovel Knight and the cultivation of the so-called retro aesthetic. The gimmick of selling people the quote-unquote nostalgia of their childhoods is, well, nothing new, but the gaming industry was more than ready to pounce on the idea once they realized it was a market venture worth pursuing. In the mid-2000s, there was a boom of independently developed video games being sold at cheaper prices than the more larger budget mainstream release video games. They were quickly dubbed indie games and were often developed at fractions of the costs of regular market standard video games. Many of these titles either had small references to classic video games or were straight up homages to that specific era. Like I said earlier, this was a capitalization on nostalgia, and yeah, it's easy to see that. Paying homage is something that happens in just about every artistic medium of creative production. But there was something else happening when indie games aesthetically mimicked retro games. Not only was a new generation of gamers introduced to this visual and audio style, but it was also providing these kinds of games with a new breath of life on stronger hardware. Shovel Knight may look like it could technically run on a Nintendo Entertainment System, but there's so many different colors and animated sprites that it would be a serious downgrade if they wanted it to run on the hardware the game's developers were paying that homage to. Games like Mutant Mudds, for instance, don't specifically mimic either 8-bit or 16-bit even, but rather invoke a blended style, one that the developer's Renegade Kid dubbed 12-bit, which, by the way, I really like that. So obviously at a certain point, using pixel art graphics and music isn't just for recreating the past, but it is also for refining a cultivated aesthetic style with newer hardware. Look at the film and television industry for just a moment, particularly in Hollywood, constantly aiming to invoke the past in some form, hoping to cultivate legacies of consumer appreciation. Whether or not this is a good or bad thing matters little. What it means for the creative production market, though, is the idea of revisitation, or to quote-unquote bet on sure things, rather than gamble with higher risks. Products of a postmodern era. Promises of new creative booms continue to shock and awe crowds, with newer photorealistic graphics and more detailed scripts that can produce more lifelike digital environments. And yet, it's all connected to the past, tethered like a ball and chain, threatening its users to remember the joy and fond memories they still have of its content, reminding you that newer ideas and riskier premises do not grip you without cynicism. You're not able to let yourself enjoy the simple pleasures of the text anymore, not without some constant reminder of the past, and reflection of yourself and your own desires, illuminated in some regard, perhaps even with the ability for you too to interact and engage with the media and artwork that captivated you once before. Sure, even the most critical of us can be swayed, and the most swayed critical themselves. But there are various times where the nostalgia creates a visual narrative, a psychic impression that we all feel comfortable with in some regard. Perhaps even the more simple, the better. Like lights on a screen, colors connected, little boxes of colors stacked on top and next to each other, displayed through a highly complex series of connections. It's something significant. Though it may seem so distant and procedure, especially as time progresses, even archaic, it is an aesthetic worth noting. And as more art galleries and museums take on and display video games and all of their pixelated glory, hopefully our connection to it need not be further than what it is, an appreciation of the past, and not just a brand to run through the mud with cheap marketing. But perhaps even that desire to separate the retro aesthetic from its existence in the material world as products that exist partially as class symbols, as well as many other symbols of social significance, is ultimately a foolish one. Video games, even for as much as I love and cherish them, are complicated pieces of media entertainment to consume sometimes, especially if you care or think about the ways that market economies affect the lives of people. You introduce some arguably difficult problems to consider. Much like every industry, there's union turbulence, there's management problems, there's greed, corporate greed. It's not easy to quantify. So, what am I getting at here? Is the retro aesthetic this exploited concept, milking our potential childhood core memories to make sure returns are easier for big tech and media companies for the next quarter? I mean, yeah, kinda. But the other point I'm getting at is that there is a technical beauty to it. There's sprite animators out there that boast some of the most gorgeous and technically efficient ways to animate, and some of them are even hobbyists, not even living off art or animation for their main income. Think about that. These guys are just people doing it for fun, and they are propelling the art form forward. Furthermore, the music compositions that were done for games from these eras translate incredibly well into many different kinds of music. Symphonic orchestras or heavy metal covers. The melodies were so well crafted in their necessity to sound pleasurable despite repetition. In its minimalism, there was born a return to simplicity, a return to colors, lights, and movement, shapes attempting to provoke the mind to imagine things, to fill in the blanks, to identify the lights as objects, people, actions, yourself. It's a lot like highly simplified drawings. Somehow, despite being no more than a collection of lines and dots, we can identify their real-world signifiers. A collection of blocks of light? Why, that's a guy leaping from vine to vine, narrowly avoiding death. Bleeps and bloops? No. Those are sounds that's imitating the putter of an engine or trumpets in a royal march. In a way, it connects onlookers to their most primal sense of sight and sound and reminds us what it is to be human, to simply recognize objects and distinguish them from one another. In that sense, it's not even a matter of these aesthetics being quote-unquote retrograde, but rather intentionally reduced, a simpler vision of an idea. And no matter how that makes players feel, one can still recognize its inherent value if one considers it from that perspective, much like appreciating the different forms of classical paintings or the audible textures of older music recordings. It's artwork, it's engineering, it's electrons moving around, and I think that's what makes the retro aesthetic so special. Somehow, despite its limitations, it brings us back home. It brings us to a simple conclusion. One that brings us to a childlike sense of enjoyment. Truly, it is a beautiful thing to play.